the discussion. So welcome everybody to our something annual CogFest at The Ohio State University. This is brought to you by the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences, the Wexner Center for the Arts, and the Undergraduate Cognitive Science Club at Ohio State. My name is Andy Lieber. I am the director of the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and this event is one of the most fun parts of my job. So I really am looking forward to this. We've got some really fun things coming up today. I'll just do a quick overview of who we are, and I'll quickly introduce the panelists, and then we can get underway. So the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences is dedicated to advancing the study of mind, brain, and formal models of cognitive processes. And what we really focus on as a center and not a department at Ohio State is interdisciplinarity. We bring people together from dozens of departments across 12 different colleges, and we engage in student training and public engagement. We have lots of programs, and we spend money on things like scholarships and other related programs. So you might be able to benefit from us in many different ways. If you want to stay up to date with our activities, I invite you to join up on our Twitter page, which is Ohio State CCBS. And if you just have money burning a hole in your pocket, you could give it to us, and we'll provide it to people who want to advance their studies in a cognitive science discipline. So I just want to also, before we begin, and so I don't forget, just give some special thanks to Tyler Senerth, who is our student assistant and just CCBS handle everything extraordinaire. And Alana Ryder, who has been working with us for this event for the last few years at the Wexner Center for the Arts, and also the Cognitive Science Club for helping generate ideas for this program and helping to promote it. And also, of course, all of you for coming. Thank you so much. So quickly, maybe not too quickly, I want to introduce our illustrious panelists today. So we have Pamela Hieronymi, who's a professor of philosophy at UCLA. And I'm not going to read everybody's descriptions because we put this in like every bit of our advertising that we've been just bombarding you all with over the last few weeks. But if you want to ask her about what it was like to do a cameo on the show, you should most definitely do that, because I want to hear about it too. The Good Place is certainly not her only area of scholarship. It's probably in her mind just a small area of scholarship. And most recently, she's been in the media just about COVID-related things, whether it's okay to shame people who are not wearing masks, or talking about vaccine resistance and things along those lines. So welcome, Pamela. We're so glad you could join us. Richard Samuels is a professor of philosophy here at The Ohio State University. His real focus with respect to the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences is that he is a philosopher of mind and philosopher of cognitive science. And his scholarship is mentioned here. He can actually say, I edited the book. So that's pretty cool on cognitive science. And we have Damian Patrick Williams. I'm sorry, I did not get your full name in there. I caught that very recently. But we're so glad that you could join us as well. Damian has his master's degree. He has 2 master's degrees, in fact, and is currently a doctoral candidate in science, technology, and society. He has a really great blog that I'll probably post in this, I don't know if I could post in the chat where everyone can see that, or we'll put it up on our website afterwards, that I invite everyone to check out. He's got some really great opinions about Janet that I can't wait to hear about. And Robin Zabrowski, who is an associate professor of cognitive science at Beloit College. And her 2 main claims to fame for this particular panel today are that, well, she has been profiled there's actually videos of her in her classroom teaching The Good Place. And the articles make reference to like Netflix and chill for a grade and things like that. I've never actually uttered those words until just now. So I'm thinking But
I just want you to know I had to complain to the newspaper to change the headline and they wouldn't. So I objected.
I had a feeling that might get under your skin. And some of Robin's scholarship has also been on cognitive science in the good place, as we can see from her publication, From Click Wheel Through Busty Alexa. So with all that said, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the attendees for coming. We're going to kick this thing off. So I'm going to close this slideshow so we can see everybody's faces. And we are going to start the Q&A. And just before I do that, if there's really a burning issue on anybody's mind that they wanted to start with on the panel, I invite the attendees to submit questions now. We can go through those as well. There are quite a few that we had been discussing in advance of the panel. So if anyone wants to jump right in, just to make sure we hit the points you had in mind first.
I think some of the things that would kind of get all of us started pretty well would probably be if we could talk a little bit about the issues of embodied cognition and identity that we kind of get exposed to within the show, between what it means for Janet to be not a robot, not a girl, but the embodied collective knowledge of the entire universe and all of existence, to what it means for each of them to be their best self. I would really like to hear everybody's kind of takes and kind of have a little bit of talk about some of that.
And if we could start, if someone wants to define what embodied cognition is, I think that would be really great.
I can take
somebody else.
I can take the embodied cognition. It's what I do. So the idea behind embodied cognition, it means like 1,000 different things, but the primary way to think about it is that it's not just the idea that you have a body and that you happen to have a brain and a mind that are like residing in the body. It's that the body provides content, or not just content, it's literally a part of the mind. And so it structures everything that we're capable of in regards to cognition in really surprising ways sometimes, like in unusual ways, maybe is the best way to think about it. So it's not just like that you have a body and you are a cognitive being, it's that most of your cognition is deeply entwined with the form of embodiment that you happen to have. And they're kind of inextricable.
So it's a little unclear how that relates to issues about personal identity. So there's very long-standing philosophical questions about personal identity, which actually get raised, I think it's probably in series 3, is that right? Where they run through, for example, a Lockean view of personal identity, and Parfitian views about personal identity get touched upon as well. And actually, personal identity in The Good Place is very, very baffling, since as they describe it, the view of personal identity that Locke propounds is the idea of continuity of memory. So that, roughly speaking, I now am the same person today as I was 3 days ago, because there's a connection of memory between me and now, me now and me 3 days ago. However, in The Good Place, you have people getting their memories deleted all the time. And yet we're told that they're the same person. And for that matter, according to many theories of personal identity over time, some at least partial sameness of body is relevant. And yet, as far as I can tell, at best, the theory or view about the nature of body in this is deeply obscure. I presume they're in an afterlife and they're disembodied, but all we ever see of them is they've got their bodies and they're lacking their memories. So how I'm supposed to think about this, I don't really know, but it's kind of a fascinating puzzle because I'm able to watch it for 4 series and find it perfectly intelligible, so long as I don't think too hard about it.
They don't remember. They don't lose their earthly. I mean, they only lose their afterlife memories, right? They maintain their, so they have that grounds for personal identity,
Yeah.
even if you delete the afterlife. But I hadn't even considered the afterlife body question.
Right. And so, yeah, that question of what is it they are actually experiencing with, right? They have, if nothing else, they have a replica of the form that they remember having had. And that kind of forces us to get kind of, inquisitive about, well, is that form a simulation of a body that they used to have? How faithful is that simulation, I guess would be the question. Because if we're talking embodied cognition and the experience, the phenomenological experience of embodiment, that felt sense of what it means to be us, that the simulation would have to be extraordinarily faithful to replicate all of those felt senses, so that we have that sense of continuity from what it felt like to be us on Earth to what it feels like to be us in this afterlife that has been constructed, such that we can continue to say, yeah, this is me. This is what I would do in these situations. Yes, I restart every so often. Yes, I've had my memory wiped 308 different times. Yes, I've, constantly been rebooted, but each time I'm presented with a new set of choices, and this is how I, however we want to then define that, would make my choices from there. That simulation would have to be really high res, right?
So Damien, I'm blanking on how we got into the Janet, how the show set up the episode in which everyone is in Janet's body in her void.
Yes.
But that seems like a spot where these things will get very very pointed.
Right.
And I literally can't remember how it happened that everyone ended up in Janet's body.
They were escaping into the accountant's office, and everybody had to jump into Janet so that they wouldn't be made discontinuous. They wouldn't be disintegrated by going somewhere they just absolutely weren't supposed to be.
So they went into her void, and did they just like automatically end up in her body then?
I actually don't remember if it was an automatic or if it was a choice that Janet made to like keep everything from being too bad.
Well, she put them in her void, but like right. We see that her body contains her void,
right?
Like physical repercussions for Janet,
right?
Which I think I agree with Richard on this, as far as the body and personal identity and everything is concerned. If you think too much about it, something's going to break a little bit. But the show challenges us in such a good way, right? Like, yes, Janet contains the void, and yet it's a boundless space that has bounds, right? And like in the afterlife, they're not actually embodied because they can come and go and reset and all kinds of things, but also all the torture is embodied, right? Chidi has pins out of his face, and they talk about butthole spiders, which like that's seared in my memory. So like bodies matter, but it's not clear how in the afterlife bodies matter. But
when
they
you've hot dogged every
lot.
hole, things get a little repetitive.
If I could just jump in and steer it a little bit towards embodiments as it relates to the demons, because they often take other forms like human forms. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
One of my favorite things about the embodiment and the demons is actually that their human forms are suits, right? Like they talk often about squishing themselves down and having to reconfigure their shape to fit these literal meat suits, and that their real form is thus massively constricted and limited in a number of ways by what they have to do to appear in a vaguely human-esque shape, right? And so one of my master's degrees is in religious studies, philosophy and religious studies. And so I think a lot about representations of angelic and demonic beings in literature, right? And there's always that be not afraid kind of moment when angels appear to humans in canon, and that space of, well, they are literally appearing to you in a way that you can kind of process, that you can deal with. And Michael says, if I showed you what I really was, you would never be able to understand me as anything except that. And I don't want that to happen. He has that like that massive shape, but he has like forcibly brought that down to something that he can use to first trick, but then relate to these other humans. And it over time becomes the thing that he wants to experience truly, not just have it be a trick, not just have it be a suit, but to have it be the thing that he can actually live as.
And I think one of the cognitive science questions that relates to the framing that Andy just offered us was this idea of like how much perhaps does Michael's being crammed into his human suit in his human form relate to the way he starts to kind of become more humanish? And this is almost certainly true of Janet as well, to whatever extent, again, if you poke too close, some of it starts to break, but like Janet seems to have humanish form, right? And over the seasons, she becomes very much a person rather than just a database of information. And so there's questions related to how much does the actual form that she's in relate to the formation of them as people as we understand them, right? So there's like embodied cognition stuff on ways that humans tend to, I'm thinking of like Lakoff and Johnson stuff on like the way we dichotomize the world. We say things like on the one hand and on the other hand, and we use our bodies as ways to make sense of things, even metaphorically. And like, I think about them crammed in humanish bodies and how much does that start to shape how they interface with the world. But I still don't really fully understand how they're crammed into that shape. So I don't want to poke too closely.
So again, I don't remember whether it made it into the final cut, but on the final episode when they were filming it, the one scene I happened to be around when they were filming was Michael becoming human, and he, one of the first things he does is feel pain in his knees. So I don't know if that made it in. Did it make it in? But it's like he's like, oh my arthritis, my back, oh my gosh, I want a burger. Yeah. And so there's so it seems like the being in that human suit, wasn't the full thing until the magic was done at the end.
There is definitely a theme in throughout. I mean, they play around with the importance of finitude for thinking about sort of the value of life and ethical value in particular. But actually, it seems to me you're right that and something I hadn't really noticed, but they do seem to tie it more closely, not merely to finitude, but to issues about human frailty and lack of capacity as well, which is sort of interesting to think about.
Yes, someone raised the question of why it should be the case that that Hypatia should have become so should have lost so much of her intelligence in the face of unending life. I thought that was an interesting question. It was like she got so bored that she then lost her sharpness.
And that question of if there's literally nothing to surprise, if there's nothing to count on as real change, if there isn't a limit to what we can know, and if there isn't some way for us to seek to surpass that limit, to press up against that limit, to define ourselves, does that harm what we can do and what we can become? Without that limitation of time, then life.
Well, so I understand that like solitary confinement might make you lose your capacity to think well, but that's not what we're talking about, right? We're just talking about limitless. So the end of the show went, and there were two of us who consulted with the show, and the end of the show went the direction of Todd's thinking, and he's definitely we need an end to give meaning to the rest of it, and I definitely don't understand that. I'm definitely not on that side of that philosophical debate. So that's why I'm thinking, like, why in the world would you run out of things to think about or do, and such that you would end up bored. I kind of understand why, if you had no challenges or no difficulties or no I understand those things, but I don't see that an endless existence, especially since humans are, I mean, oh gosh, I'm so bad at names. Tahini. No, tahini is the sauce. Tahani, thank you. I mean, so I kind of felt like she had the right answer, that she was like, there's still humans being created. There's still work to be done here. I'm going to go and fulfill my my life, you know, my life and post-life dream of being a benefactress and doing good things. And so it wasn't, I don't know, I was disappointed in Hypatia.
But I think that's
Eleanor,
actually,
to some extent, took your view as well, at least for many Jeremy Baramies, we can say.
yes.
So we have some questions now from one. We have one from Theodore. If the demons fit into human suits, it stands to reason that angels / light beings fit into them as well. For instance, the Good Place Committee. Why did the Good Place Committee not need to hide their true form in the same way?
I would say they maybe did. You know, we don't ever know what they actually look like under there. You know, we know that they are once again presenting themselves as human-ish, but you know, the whole framework that we're given to understand is this is a metaphor, a visual and experiential metaphor for humans to, you know, wrap their brains around. It's not the actual experience, whether we're talking, you know, the form that Janet takes and the way that you can relate to her, the form that Michael takes and the way that you can relate to them, or the Good Place Committee. And they, you know, they might be 12 wheels covered in billions of eyes and 6 pairs of wings. They might literally be, you know,
So it might be the
innumerable.
case that I'm not sure if Theodore meant to write it that way, but we could ask the opposite side of that question. Why did the Good Place Committee need to hide their true form in some way?
Yeah. Be ye not
If they
afraid.
Yeah.
like,
Mhm.
like
So one of the things
terrifying.
One of the things a bit striking about, I mean, so ultimately it's a comedy, and it's often unclear when you're watching sort of a serial like this to what extent decisions are made on the basis of what makes for good drama or good humor, and what has some sort of underwritten sort of philosophical or theoretical backing. One of the things that's fun about the Good Place is that there's a really fun blending of these things. It doesn't turn into it doesn't turn into a philosophical text. It would be much less fun to watch had it done so. And I wonder whether or not this is one of these decisions where it's rather more amusing and rather more fun to have the people running heaven sort of look like the rest of us and be rather sort of uninteresting, unexceptional human beings, or at least appear so, rather than being sort of, as it were, lofty, angelic figures.
Well, and they've got to run out too. They've got to be like, oh my gosh, we're done with this. Take it over. We're gone, right? So if they're lofty and angelic, that's not going to work.
Right. That's not going to work so well, is it?
And I'm also remembering the one where they briefly entertain the idea that the all-knowing judge is a burrito, right? Like the episode of Burrito, like where they're like, maybe this is the judge. And so like I think they play with this exact idea to be like, yeah, we're not going to do that because who would still be watching, right? So
that question of, you know, and also it contains, like in the lamp shading, it contains the, we have no idea. Humans have no idea what might be real here. So you know, maybe the judge is a burrito, but maybe she's just that lady.
So we have another embodiment related question from Alyssa. We're told that all of the demons have a human form to learn how best to torture. Is there a connection between their understanding of cognition in that human form and those demons eventually being able to learn to test humans rather than torture them outright, like they've apparently done for millennia? So this is, you know, embodiment in a specific form, altering cognition, providing insight into the human experience. So, you know, this question, you know, we could unpack it in a few different ways. There's so many different directions you could take this one in, but maybe if we just start with, or do demons gain more perspective by embodying the humans to learn how to torture?
mean, think of Vicky, right? She's like the most vain, like she's so human. She's like the most human demon there is, right? I mean, Michael aside, but like she's like, I want to be running the show. And then like in the first time when she is running the show, isn't the opening when they show the movie, doesn't she like break out into song and stuff? Like I don't remember exactly how that happens, but when she takes over, she's so human. And she's always like method acting about it. She's like, I need to know what my motivation is. I understood real Eleanor, but I don't understand the pizza place lady. And so like, I mean, I think the answer is maybe yes. Maybe the fact that they take on these human forms really does influence the way that they understand humanity.
So what's the question intended to get at the issue of whether or not once they converted back into demonic form, they were able to preserve the understanding they'd acquired from being in human form? It sort of sounded as though that was at least something that was suggested by the question, whether or not a mastery of that sort of understanding could be preserved under those sorts of transitions between body types. That's what they tell us.
Yeah, seems okay to me, but I'm not the specialist here.
Right.
So one of the interesting things that like when we talk about the embodiment and the phenomenology of things, like we think about that from, not necessarily a giant demonic cosmic perspective, but like the embodied disability perspective, right? You think about what happens when you have a limb amputated, or you lose or change the fidelity of sense, right? If something else happens and you regain the ability to smell after having lost it for a while, or regain hearing after having lost it, or lose hearing after having gained it, and but having lost it before that. Like any change, we retain some ability to think in that mode. We retain the understanding of what that felt like, of what that did for us, of the experiential knowledge that opened up for us in a way that was otherwise unavailable to us, right? It doesn't just go away, even if the situation of our embodiment does change after the fact. What we might be able to learn if we could radically change our morphology, if we could actively like physically change our shape, like to a radical and intentional degree, and then change it back. What we might be able to understand could be really interesting and vast.
I think you anticipated Jeremy's question here, which goes not only in the direction of disability, but also in other aspects of identity like gender, race, age, that are appearance-based. And based on what I know that Robin has done, I can see that she wants to maybe weigh in about how people have experienced other types of body forms by using technology like the Oculus Rift or something. I don't know if I'm calling you out on that, but if that's your thing. So, but if and Damien as well, if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, so this relates to stuff I wrote my dissertation on like 15 years ago, but yeah, I asked questions about how technology or just differing kinds of bodies could change the way cognition happens, considering conceptualization is so deeply bound up with the ways we experience the world. So I thought about things like the performance artist Stellark, who in the 80s, way before this should have been possible, totally built himself a third robotic arm with, I think it was Tokyo University, they helped with in the robotics department, a third arm that he hooked up via EMG through his thigh. So it wasn't like wired in, it was totally external, but he wore it for long enough that he gained intentional control of the third arm. It was slow and awkward, but it worked. And there's images of him doing performances where he's writing the word evolution with all three hands at once. The images are way more powerful than the performance because the performance was slow and clunky, but the image captures it, right? Like he has a third arm, and if he wore that thing all the time, to what extent would that alter the way he thinks in the world? And again, I think this relates to Damien's disability question as well. Like, to what degree do these changes matter? Which is kind of related back to Richard's earlier point about personal identity and memory, right? Like, you can remember what it was like to only have 2 arms, and those are deeply built structures. So maybe Stellark would have had to be born with 3 arms to actually have it affect cognition in that deep way or something. There's not an answer to this question, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I definitely think that the cognitive science part of it has, like, you can read it through The Good Place in really interesting ways.
Awesome. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit, if everyone's okay with that, and jump over to some moral decision making. It's an ongoing theme throughout the show, and there are many different ways we can discuss that. Possibly the most salient is the trolley problem episode, which is always one of the greatest hits in the cognitive science realm. So I don't have any particular direction there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
I said in the first episode that when they actually do the trolley problem episode, that Michael was the only person I've ever seen who fully and completely understands the trolley problem. And I said it again when he exhibited that knowledge at the end of that season. Like the notion of what it means to make decisions, not just from the purely utilitarian or the purely deontological as what we were given prior to that point, but from that kind of care-based double effect kind of, what might I do for someone else, and how might I display what I owe to someone else that does not necessarily worry about what I owe to me, or that places what I owe to them above what might be my own personal needs, was something really interesting to see explored on screen. And I really, one of the things I've most appreciated about the show.
Yeah, so I was actually looking at a question, there's a question in the Q&A that is about how it is that Michael, who's a demon, who's not supposed to have feelings and has been torturing people forever, how can he have such a big change of heart? And I mean, so I'm definitely not answering this from a embodied cognition point of view, but just from the point of view of the show and the ethical themes that the show is exploring. The show is about how to become a better person, and it opens with the idea that being a better person is about scoring points. And then that is, which is that is similar to the consequentialist idea that the trolley problem illustrates, with the thought that you should save the greater number. So the number of people are now like points. And then you have Chidi, who's very concerned about all the rules, and that's the deontological bit. And that's illustrated in the trolley problem with the thought that you mustn't kill anybody. So don't touch that dial because you could kill somebody, even if it brings about the better outcome, or don't, so, and the way the show, at least through season 1 and 2, and then comes back to a little bit in season 3, lands in the idea that that it's about what we owe to each other. That is to say, it's about our relationships with other people, and that the motivation, especially towards the end of season 2, that the motivation for becoming good is coming from relationships. So that's where I think the Michael idea is. It's that he's been in relationship with these people and become friends with them, and that's the sort of transformative thing that he's done. And I think it's fun. I mean, so this is the reason that I think the reason that Michael Schur contacted me to talk to me is that I had a paper on my website that at one point was called "Why You Can't Be Good by Trying," and the idea of it is it's kind of Eleanor's problem, right? So that if you are not a good person, it's because you're lacking good motives. And one sort of advice you might get, and you get it from Aristotle, is, well, do what the good person does until you become a better person. kind of fake it till you make it. But then, and everybody knows that practice makes perfect. So, and that is really good advice, actually, but it's very puzzling why this should work. Because if practice makes perfect, why don't you just become a really great faker? Right? Like, why don't you just get really good at faking it? Because like motives aren't like muscles. It's not like repetition makes them better. And so you can't, sorry. So Eleanor is now, and in fact, if your only motive for trying to become better is a selfish motive, it now seems like you might be in the same position of the insomniac, which is to say, the more you try, the worse it gets, right? And so we see that in that episode where, I mean, they actually explore this through the first part of the thing, and where in the episode where they're convinced they will never get out of, that they'll never succeed, and they go out to see Mindy, or so that Eleanor has to go to the bad place. She's like, that's it, I have to do it. They go out and they meet Mindy, and then Eleanor decides basically she has to, she has to do it for her friends. It's what we owe to each other. And so again, it's that connection to other people that eventually allows her to make that transformation that she can't get by just effort or self-interested effort.
So I don't remember the ordering on it, but was Michael already friends with them at the point that Chidi induces this existential crisis? So there's this sort of familiar theme that runs through it that maybe, and this is something I'd really like to come back to, that you become better by doing moral philosophy, which I found sort of fascinating and maybe not true. But the problem that Michael's having mastering sort of at least human ethical values, or becoming able to think in an ethical manner and make decisions according to ethical norms, seems to be that he doesn't have any conception of his life ending, and that seems really important to get him to appreciate. So Chidi goes around, sort of goes out of his way to induce this existential crisis. Is that after or before they've become friends? I don't recall.
It's right at the beginning. So it's after, but right at the beginning. And I think I know what the second, in the start of the second season, I think it was, they when they had me come into the writer, so I just met with them at once for each season. I didn't see scripts or anything like that, but they wanted sort of big picture questions. And one of their questions was, how would you teach a demon to be good? And I think they must have asked Todd that question too. And in that episode, you get both of our answers, actually.
That's right. That's what I was just, yeah.
So so my answer was, you need to overpower him, right? Like he needs to come up against, he needs to be in a position in which he has to make compromises, in which he has to start to see his own, I mean, they have in common vulnerability, right? He has to start to see his own vulnerability. And Todd's answer is he needs to see his finitude, right? And so you get both of the, you get the coup of demons, you get the demons ganging up on the demons, and that makes Michael need to start to be friends with the, this actually might be over more than one episode, but with the humans. And then you get the trolley episode, which is where he's for the first time realizing that he's not the expert at, like, there's something that he's not the expert at, that Chidi's better than he is. Yep. And then he gets really, that's when he tortures them with the trolley problem. And then Eleanor has to say, you're doing an Eleanor, you're feeling threatened, and so you got mean, right? And then I think it's then that you go into the, I think it's the next thing that you get into the existentialism, the existential crisis. I could be screwing up the order though. But anyway, I think the existential crisis and the demon coup were both meant to put pressure on Michael to
Right.
make him need to start to consider his own vulnerability and then to start to consider his relation to others.
Right.
So
Just to-
also that question of like, it isn't immediate for him, right? Like he's been in a relationship with them. It's been a bad relationship. It's a terrible, torturous, abusive relationship. He's been in a relationship with these humans
Right.
for, you know, a total of 308 different, you know, cycles.
Mhm.
He has been doing this for centuries, millennia of torture for them. And he's come to know them and relate to them in a real way. But when he has that moment of, you know, I am threatened, my power is threatened, and I might, you know, I have to figure out a way to save myself on these multiple levels. These are the people he reaches out to. These are the relationships he has. That's exactly where he starts to truly, like, as you said, Pamela, that's exactly where he starts to like think about what value relationship might have. But this is a long time. It
Yeah.
takes him a very long time, like showtime, you know, within the context of the narrative. That's several, you know, many human lifetimes to learn what most of us learn if we're good about it by middle school, right? Like that's
Yeah,
a
it's, I
lot.
mean, it's interesting. I'm going back to something Richard commented. Like, it's interesting to listen to, like, the questions that come up when you sort of fully go into the assumptions of the show, and the questions that come up, you know, if you're like, I hadn't thought about it quite that hard before, you know, because I'm just thinking, oh yeah, that moment, that laugh, that moment at the end of season 1, like, is it believable that he hasn't been their friend the whole time? I'm not thinking, is it believable that he hasn't been their friend for millennia? I'm just thinking, like, you know, for a season, that's what I was worried about.
Right.
But yeah, you're right.
So we've got a few open questions here that might relate. So we've got one from Tobias, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Leaving aside the question of whether it's a good idea, how well do you think Doug Forsythe succeeds at being a happiness pump?
Does he succeed?
He could probably do better. For example, he could be more proximate to other human beings. So he lives out quite distanced from lots of other people. So his interactions with other people who can exploit him in this matter is relatively limited. But the interactions he seems to have with others seem to result in him doing whatever is required in order to make those around him happy, no matter how preposterous or unreasonable their requests and expectations are.
And given that the social question, as Pamela was just mentioning, like, the social relationships are what make people good in this show, right? That's the solution to the problem. It's weird to hold Doug Forsythe up as like the guy who ought to be a shoo-in for the good place, right? For exactly this reason. He's so isolated. There's no opportunity for social good there. He lives off radishes, right? Like, it's just, it's weird. I think that maybe he's not as successful at it as they wanted to portray him as.
Well, so I mean, it's a little bit of a strange question of how successful he is as a happiness pump, because the idea of a happiness pump is meant, I mean, the idea is that there's a problem, there's a kind of paradox or problem here. So how successful is he in racking up points? Highly successful. That's the thing. How successful is he in generating happiness? Not much at all. Right. And so I mean, it doesn't quite fit into the good place the well as it might, but the original thought is, if morality is about bringing about happiness in the way that the utilitarians think it is, what if it's the case that trying to bring about happiness doesn't make you happy? Now what? right? And it might seem that trying to bring about happiness, it will not lead to a happy life. And so if everyone was trying to be Doug Forsett, and that was the way we were trying to be happy, then we wouldn't succeed in the very thing that we were trying to succeed in. So it's got that same self-defeating possibility of the insomniac at work there.
Doug Forsett has no real relationships. He has that kid that comes by and makes him do stuff. Like that is the only person that we know that Doug Forsett interacts with any regularity, right? He specifically does live away from other people so that he limits his opportunity to get tripped up by the various things that might go wrong or that he might do wrong. He lives in the woods where he can do the least harm and try to maximize his good. But yeah, all of those things are the wrong way to think about what it means to be a good person. He's very good at having the wrong idea.
So let's jump to two related issues about cheating. The first one is the cognitive basis of indecision. And the related part that some might see as related is Chidi's stomach aches and what the significance are of those and how they might interact with behavior.
I have a theory about this that I was so excited about that I felt like I was vindicated at the beginning of season 3. So Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist and a medical doctor, has a hypothesis called the somatic marker hypothesis. And he argues that things like our gut feelings are actually really well cultivated guides to morality, and in particular social morality. And so the idea is that we're all born as human beings with like this evolutionary like blueprint for emotion, and it gives us, happiness, sadness, etc. But as we develop over the course of our lifetimes, those primary levels of emotion get cultivated into secondary emotions, where we can, instead of just feeling happy, we can feel euphoric or joy or glee. I won't explain the neuroscience behind it all, but he had devised these amazing experiments to make sense of certain social failures of individuals who had damage to their ventral medial prefrontal cortices. And they, like, only in the real world did the system break down. They passed every clinical test that they were ever given. And so Damasio finally developed these sort of card games that tested people in slightly more realistic situations. And that was where he started to see that they would be like, yeah, I didn't get a gut feeling. Like, I didn't build up a marker about what would be a good way to solve this problem and what wouldn't. And all of the people who had functioning ventromedial prefrontal cortices did start to build up these like gut reactions to certain things in these tasks. And Chidi just seems like the most brilliant example of this ever, right? He has every moral law in his brain. And yet he never trusts his stomach aches. Like, he's the very first episode, he's like, I'm in a perfect utopia and I have a stomach ache. And I screamed. I was teaching Intro to Cog Sci and I was teaching Damasio when I saw that episode, and I screamed and I was like, oh my God, there's something here. And as I watched it progress, I got more and more sure. And then in season 3, when they stick him in an MRI machine and oh my God, what's the name of the neuroscientist?
Simone.
Simone's like, well, here's your ventral medial prefrontal cortex. I was like, oh, thank God. Like, it just seems like it, I feel like it had to be intentional. Like, they had to know Damasio's work or something like it, because it's just so perfectly, like, it slots right in.
That's interesting. On Chidi, I wanted to comment to Richard's question about the idea that moral philosophy should make you a better person, and it's not clear to me that that's the lesson of the show. And one of my favorite repeating comments is, "That's why everyone hates moral philosophers."
There is a familiar theme throughout the show that people will become better. Eleanor seems firmly convinced of this at various points, that people can become better by studying moral philosophy. And I guess there is a sort of a fairly obvious sort of empirical question there, whether or not certain kinds of studying actually do improve your behavior in certain kinds of ways. And maybe someone else here knows this stuff better than me, but the only attempts that I'm aware of to address this problem empirically is a pair of papers by a philosopher, Eric Schwitzgebel, Riverside. And one of the more recent one is a paper that he and Peter Singer are co-authors. I don't recall the third author, where they're trying to see the impact on undergraduate students of studying the ethics of, let's say, ethics associated with, let's say, eating animals or eating battery farmed chickens and stuff like that. And it's really quite inconclusive, but it's sort of a fascinating question. And I have very little sense of the extent to which moral philosophers think about the thing that they're engaged in as being largely a theoretical enterprise, or whether or not they feel that by doing this, it's going to result in sort of, as it were, improvements in the human condition.
Yeah, I think there's a wide range of opinion about that. And I mean, my own thinking on it would be that the kind of study of ethics that Chidi is is walking people through and that you get in college is not the kind of formative moral formation that makes you a better person that is probably happens much earlier in life.
Right.
But that for that reason, it doesn't mean that these theories and ideas and ways of organizing the terrain and the subject matter aren't useful and impactful in thinking about difficult problems.
Mm-hmm.
So this is that place where we kind of run up against the show as text versus metatext again, because one of the things that, looking at it as we are now, I'm thinking about is Eleanor thinks that everybody can become a better person by learning moral philosophy because it happened to her. And she went from having that selfish motivation to having that motivation to actually do good for the sake of doing good, because it's what we owe to each other. That was because of the relationship she built with Chidi. So she, even if she doesn't quite recognize it, is trying to spur those kinds of relationships as well. And so what happens for everyone isn't just that they end up having a study group together, it's that everybody ends up building relationships with each other through this study group. They begin to want to do right by each other. They begin to want to help each other and not just help themselves. And so it's no longer just about, learn moral philosophy and you'll be a better person. It's do anything together for the sake of each other and you'll become a better person.
So let's jump to artificial intelligence. We have a question from Sarah that is not specifically about artificial intelligence. Actually, it is, but it's related to neurobiology of humans. If so much of what makes a human body or humanness is neurobiology, through what mechanism does Janet or the demons become more human-like? So we haven't talked much about Janet thus far. I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
I hope we didn't oversell the neurobiology part. Like, certainly in us, in the kinds of creatures we are, that's a huge part of it. But I think that the embodied cognition stuff, the good parts of it anyway, acknowledge the social world, the physical world, the cultural world. All of that is part of what embodiment kind of means. And I love Janet. I think Janet is amazing the way she becomes a person. She there's a moment where she's like, I think I hate things now too. Like, it's amazing. And I think a lot of this again comes back to the social part. I think that Janet had never been put in the sort of situation where these relationships were possible for a creature like her. I'm thinking about something like Dieger and DiPaolo's participatory sense making. It's like a theory of social cognition that talks about the ways that certain kinds of cognition are literally only enabled when other people are involved, and like genuine new dynamic systems of engagement emerge. but only when there's two sense-making creatures engaging together. And that's how I think Janet gets to be what she is. She's just finally getting to be a social being, and that's doing so much of the work.
It's also, I mean, just as a sort of, there's a sort of, it seems to me an obvious thought from, which is very familiar from the philosophy of mind, which is worth noting here. So issues about the extent to which a body is relevant to the sort of cognitive agents you are is in a way related but orthogonal to a question about whether or not the right way of thinking about what's important about a body or about a brain is something specifically to do with its neurobiology, or whether or not the relevant kinds of relations are ones which are more abstractly characterized. So there's a very familiar view, and it's really there at the inception of artificial intelligence, where the thought is that it's the right kinds of what are sometimes described as functional relations, but roughly speaking, causal connections between different states, whether they be states from the environment, states of the body, states of a brain, states of perceptual organs like the eyes and the ears. And at least according to this sort of view, which had a big influence on both artificial intelligence and cognitive science and its development, there is a respect in which an artificial agent, such as a computational system like Janet, could be, in the relevant respects, similar to a human being. It's obviously something which is well beyond our capacities as programmers or theoreticians to do this at the moment. But if this sort of underlying idea has sort of a reasonable degree of accuracy to it, it should at least be in principle a possibility. Janet is very clearly beyond our current capacities to produce.
Yes.
But she's also, I mean, I was just thinking about Janet and Michael as a pair.
Yeah.
And, you know, Michael needs that existential crisis, needs that, you know, needs vulnerability to be open to developing his relationships in the direction that they need to go. And we never have that with Janet. And perhaps it's because she's you know, she starts her existence as a service worker in a certain way. But anyway, it's an interesting pairing.
That's a really interesting point. The positionality of social relations. So Janet starts her life as a service, you know, as a service being. You know, she is, her point is to do things for others. And as she develops up out of that, she thinks in terms of her relationality to others more clearly. And so it does stand out as that moment, that clarity, that marker when she hates something, because she was never allowed to have a real opinion on things before. It was never within the realm of possibility or consideration for her. And this is something that we can kind of see when we talk about like the way that the ethics of care kind of did start to think about you know, ethics of care and you know, feminist ethics of power. When we started to think about what was missing in feminist epistemologies, work about people like a Lorraine Code talking about what was missing from efforts towards artificial intelligence, right? That question of, it's not just about the intellect, it's not just about, you know, the faithful reproduction of rationality and reasoning capabilities. It's about, it has to be about something about the way that we relate to other people, the way that, you know, the social life, the social situatedness is reproduced in some way that allows for what we think of as intelligence or consciousness or mindedness. And Janet, as she becomes a person, because she starts off saying not a person, you know, which I personally disagree with at the outset, but we'll leave that off to the side for the moment. But she starts off saying not a person, but eventually she has to take on, no, I'm a me. I'm a Janet, but I'm something way more and different and other than just one among many Janets now. Maybe every Janet can be that. And that's something that we get to see with Bad Janet at the end as well.
So we're all good place things must come to an end. And we're getting close, but I want to maybe squeeze in this one additional question. How do you feel the discussion of morals on the good place will look, and maybe not just constrained to morals, but how will it look many years down the road? Do you think the collective moral attitude or message will age well, or will it change with the times? Do you think it's possible that the moral attitudes will make the show feel dated someday? So hard to prognosticate, but.
So yeah, so I actually, so my opinion, yeah, so I have an opinion about this. I think the big structure that I laid out at the beginning about points, rules, relationships, I think that'll age just fine. There's a lot of decisions that Mike and his team made about casting that I think will look dated. Because he was, very intentionally putting, the Asian guy as the airhead, for example, and the Pakistani woman as the beauty queen, and like all of those decisions, I think those will look dated. I hope those will look dated, but I don't think the storyline will look dated.
I kind of reach back forward to the end, but then from there back thousands of years. When I say that, I don't know that it will, because the questions of morality that are so entangled, so intertwined, Chidi and Eleanor's last conversation, right? We're talking about what we do, what we owe to each other, and what happens at the end. Chidi reaches to Buddhism and Hinduism. And the questions that we're wrestling with about what happens to us when we step through that gate at the end of the day, what happens to us when we decide to make a relationship with somebody, when we decide to build lives together with each other, what becomes of the I and the we and all of that. All of those questions are questions that we've been wrestling with as a species for literally thousands of years. So I think that we'll, what the show has to say on that 5, 10, 15 years from now will probably still be an interesting and relevant conversation. And it blends enough different perspectives and puts them into real conversation with each other that it makes it worthwhile to spend that time with it.
Excellent. Well, just like we've been asking those questions for thousands of years, we could probably go on asking these same questions for thousands of more years in this one session, but Zoom hopefully won't exist by then, thousands of years from now.
We'll just teletransport to one another then.
Yes.
Well,
I'll be in the Matrix by then. Maybe that's another program CCBS will cover in the future. So really, I just, I'm sure on behalf of all the attendees here, I want to thank all of the panelists for a really stimulating and fun discussion. I'm so glad we got to put this together. Thanks to the Wexner Center and Cognitive Science Club, and thanks to all the attendees. So we'll, for any follow-ups on here, we'll be posting the video that we recorded. Just stay tuned to Ohio State CCBS, and from there you'll be able to link out to Damien's blog and maybe some of Robin's Twitter posting as well, which is often the highlight of my day.
Ixnay on the Twitter.
She's like, just make sure to cut this video about 30 seconds before the actual end. But really, this has been so great. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the spring, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, that is. Enjoy the winter if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Let's all be healthy and safe, and hope to see you around the next time. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
Andrew,
you.
too.
yes,
Thank you so much.
All right.